Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on the 510K submission, requirements, contents, and options. My name is Michael, and I'll be your host for today's session. And on behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's session. Today's webinar is being presented by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. A few words about Jeff before we start off today's session. Mr. Kassoff, RAC CQM, is also the Director of Quality at Medivators, which is a leading manufacturer of endoscopy and colonoscopy devices, where he oversees the operation of the quality system. And in this position, Jeff is responsible for oversight of the document control system, and also is the primary liaison with the regulatory affairs officials. And also prior to this, Jeff spent over 13 years at LifeTech Incorporated as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, where he was responsible for compliance of the corporate quality system. And Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in 1996 and his Quality Management certification in 2013. And we are honored to have Jeff with us today to present today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start off today's session, I just want to quickly outline today's program. This session is for a 60-minute duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that he would cover and then share with you his presentation. And also would like to inform all our participants today that once part of today's teleconference, you've been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins. We have a couple of minutes at the end for your question and answers, but if you do come up with questions during the session, please post them in the chat messenger or the Q&A panel, and we can get to those questions at the end once the presentation is done. And for any reason, ladies and gentlemen, if you do get logged out of today's session, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all ready, I request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thanks so much for the introduction. Let me begin by welcoming everybody to the webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars in the past, I really think the only detriment, the only downside that you're going to see is that, well, quite honestly, I can't see you and you can't see me. The way I like to address that is at the end of the presentation, let's extend the Q&A session as long as you want. If you feel that you want the Q&A session to morph, if you will, into a exchange of ideas, I'm more than happy to do that as well. Today's webinar, as everybody knows, is about the 510K submission. It's how to write it, what to do once you put it together, ways to submit it, all sorts of things like that. You know, what you should do in the meantime, how to respond, and so on and so forth. The thing about the FDA submission is that it's very prescriptive, meaning that there are certain types of documents, certain contents that you must submit. This almost flies in the face from a contradictory nature of the QSR or the GMP regulations, whichever you choose to call them, in which they're very non-specific. You need to comply with certain regulations as part of your normal day-to-day operations. But when it comes to writing the submission, there are so many sections and so many subsections that are required in the document that it almost feels overwhelming. On the other hand, what you'll see here is my interpretation of the regulations, and it's not, at the risk of giving myself too little credit, it's not much of an interpretation. The regulations are very, very assistive, very helpful when it comes to telling us what the requirements, contents, and options are for your 510K submission. The outline of this presentation, I'll begin with when to submit a 510K for a new or modified product, what you're supposed to do if you make a change to your device, how you know whether to submit a 510K. Then I'll cover the types of 510Ks, because there are several, and when you should use each of those. And then the contents of 510K, part of which will be a question I'm asked more often than not, which is, how do I know if clinical data is required? Then I'll talk about, now that you have the 510K, how you put it together, how you submit it. The fact that you have to pay to submit the 510K is, I'm going to date myself here, a relatively new concept, meaning probably 10 to 12 years ago, if not a little longer, 510Ks were free. What FDA was finding was that they had to spend so many resources, they had to hire so many people to review 510Ks some of which were more firms just taking the conservative way. You know what? We're going to make this change, and we're not even going to evaluate whether or not we need to submit a new 510K. We're just going to go ahead and submit a 510K because it doesn't cost us anything. It costs a little time, perhaps, but better safe than sorry. When industry started to challenge, when the agency started to challenge industry from a financial perspective, that was when a lot of executive management took a step back and said, well, now I'm going to try to determine whether or not I need to submit a new 510K. And that's when the guidance document titled, I'll paraphrase here, when to submit a new 510K came out, giving us in the industry marching orders, direction, as far as when we could or didn't have to submit a new 510K. And just a few words at the end there on how to interact with the FDA and how to interact with the reviewer. I promise, I swear to each and every one of you that I have been asked each of these questions in my long, if not illustrious career in regulatory and quality assurance. And all of these questions were asked by CEOs, by executive management who you would think would know better. And in each of these cases, I was astounded to be asked this question. First question, as it says here, Jeff, since our device is identical to our competitors, can't we just use their 510K? Okay. Second question from a CEO, actually he was an EVP, Executive Vice President, who sort of was on the complete other end of that fence is, well, doesn't each and every change and each and every product line expansion require a 510K? Second question, more of a reasonable question, but still a question I've been asked is, will the FDA inspect my company prior to 510K clearance? That's less, absolutely not, and more, not necessarily. Do I need to register my facility before I submit a 510K? And the last question is more laughingly asked than anything else, which is, does the FDA usually meet their 90-day clearance goal? To me, the 90-day clearance goal, and those of us who've been around a little while, to a large extent is less of a goal and more of a pipe dream. Back in the day, there were situations where FDA really made it their goal and promulgated KPIs, metrics, that showed us in industry where they were in meeting this goal. To me, this goal is a lot like the probably a little more anecdotal FDA guideline to inspect medical device and pharma firms every 2 years. It's a goal, it's an idea, it's not anything that they track themselves towards. I like to begin at the end, which is to say the 510K letter, not litter, sometimes maybe, is the document that you receive stating, it's from the agency, stating that your device is substantially equivalent to an existing device called the predicate device, that your device is also safe and effective based on data that you provided in your submission. This letter from FDA clears your device for commercial distribution. It does not approve your device in any way for any use at all. I'm not usually the kind of person who likes to regulate speech, specifically inter and intra-departmental speech. However, when you hear people speaking at your company about, well, we got that 510K approval last week, what's going on? I definitely think it's incumbent upon us in the RAQA field to tenderly, to nicely, good-naturedly let people know that that's not the accurate term for a 510K, for pre-market notification. Our device is cleared for commercial distribution, and it's not approved. And it really doesn't matter what people say around the, I guess there's really no water coolers anymore. Let's call it the Keurig device. However, when people get used to using terminology, they may use it elsewhere where it's not that good. If you go to a trade show and you advertise your device as approved for commercial distribution, you will probably receive a visit from the FDA inspectors who routinely walk the floor at trade shows. Interestingly enough, your device cannot be marketed before the 510K is received. It's not very interesting. It's obvious. However, there is a slight area that the agency gives us. If you have submitted your 510K and you have received a notification that says, well, hey, thanks for your 510K, here's a number, you'll hear from us sometime in the future. Once you receive a 510K number at a trade show, you can exhibit your device as FDA clearance, remember not approval but clearance, pending. The reason the agency does this is they're really doing us a solid here. They're realizing that we have devoted sufficient time and money and overall resources to that we are very serious in taking our device to commercialization. Therefore, we should be able to exhibit it pending, of course, the agency's clearance to market that device. As I said earlier, it costs money to submit a 510K. For the current fiscal year, the standard fee is $5,100 and the small business fee is $25.85. And throughout this presentation, you'll see, obviously they're not links because you'll probably get a PDF, at least citations for web locations of how to do certain things. The first one here is how to qualify your business as a small business. There's certain financial information that you need to provide to FDA. And then once that's, and fill out a form, of course, it's the government, right? And once you will receive, usually 30 some odd days later, something that states that you have been approved as a small business. You've got to have less than $100 million in sales. If you don't, you can't qualify as a small business. It's not size, it's sales. And once you do, you'll receive a particular number that your company will be a small business number, and that's how you identify yourself on the 510K submission. When it comes to review fees also, you've got to fill out a medical device user fee cover sheet. And when you send your $2,500 or $5,100 in advance of your 510K, with the payment, which goes to a different location than the submission itself, you're going to identify your company, your small business number on the user fee cover sheet. I recommend that when you send the payment, you send it a full day prior to submission. I don't have to tell anybody attending this webinar that in the government, sometimes one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. So if you send it one day, chances are it gets received and logged into their system so that when your 510K is received and they want to make sure, of course, before they do anything that you've paid for it, that they can identify that within their system. There are two exemptions to the requirement for review fees, and excuse me, these are the devices that are much more important, at least the pediatric-only device. I'll talk a little more later about third-party submissions. Briefly at this point, a third party is a company, a private company, to which you submit your 510K, they review it, and they have been licensed, authorized by FDA to grant you clearance. So we'll talk a little about that. You have to pay for that service. So FDA realizes that you shouldn't have to pay twice for the same service. As phrase I used earlier, predicate device is the device to which you claim equivalence within your 510K submission. In order to find a good predicate device, because you don't want to be called out during your review that your predicate device is not applicable, classify your device. And the way to do this is to go into the 510K database at this address. And if you're, in many cases, we have regulatory staff, and we kind of know where to go to look for our classification, if not know it already, because we can look at our predicate device that we're going to compare to and find out what their classification is. But in the situation where you don't know this at all, maybe you're a small startup, you haven't written a 510K before, I mean, many of us have been there. You go to this website and you look at the classification panel, and you pretty much just look throughout the 7-digit CFR regulations. The fields are common name and product code, and you just look to see the device that you believe your device is. And therefore, once you do that, you're able to locate on the FDA website predicate devices to compare your device to. The concept of substantial equivalence is not identicalness. It's equivalent. It's substantially equivalent. So it's a little more than just equivalent. And what you're saying is that your device is at least as safe and effective as the predicate. The way to normally do this is to provide safety and efficacy data with your submission. Also, you're saying that your device has the same intended use and technological characteristics as the predicate device, or that you have the same intended use and different technological characteristics, but the data you provide in your 510K shows that there's no additional questions of safety and effectiveness. So again, you're providing safety and efficacy data to support your device's clinical use. As I mentioned a moment ago, not necessary to be identical. I've listed here a couple of handfuls of ways, criteria with which substantial equivalence is established. Any of these that you can use, obviously the more the better. In some circumstances, you might not know. If you're trying, excuse me, if you're writing a 510K and using a competitor's product as your predicate device, you might not know their manufacturing process. But if you're using your own device as the predicate device, you do know the manufacturing process. So any or all of these that can be used should be used. When it comes to, do I need to submit a 510K, there are several questions that need to be asked. The first question is, where am I marketing the device? If I'm a domestic manufacturer introducing a device to the U.S. market, sure, I do need to submit a 510K. If I'm a foreign manufacturer, or maybe a U.S. representative of a foreign manufacturer, perhaps a branch or a subsidiary, and I'm introducing a device to the U.S. market, yes, I do need to submit a 510K. It's where you're selling the device. It's the market, not the location of the manufacturer. Remember, just in the back of your minds when you're evaluating whether you need to submit a 510K, any accessories that can be sold directly to the end user are also considered finished devices. So if they can be used by themselves, then they are considered finished devices. Second question to ask yourself in determining who is required to submit a 510K is whose name is on the label. With regard to a specification developer who is introducing a device to the U.S. market, consider a firm that develops specifications for a finished device but has the device manufactured by another firm. This firm does need to submit a 510K. Another question to ask far less frequently than most is who changes the device? About, wow, I don't even know how long it's been, but I was in the industry beforehand when the increased prevalence of repackagers and relabelers began to be introduced, and FDA realized that they needed to regulate this practice because these are companies who make labeling changes or repair or relabel or repackage a device and therefore significantly affect the device. And these firms do need to submit a 510K in situations where the labeling is significantly changed or the condition of the device is affected. If they're modifying the manuals, maybe they're adding a new intended use, and we'll talk a little about intended use in a little while. If they're deleting or adding warnings, or their operations could alter the condition of the device. There is, in some cases, it's medical facilities such as hospitals. However, there are private firms out there that reprocess single-use devices and then resell them. These firms are significantly changing a device enough that they do need to submit a 510K. There are several situations in which a 510K is required. The no-brainer of these is you're introducing a brand new device for the first time. Second of these is you have a device that you're already selling and you're changing the intended use. The intended use is usually indicated by claims made in the labeling or in the advertising. An example is changing a device from prescription use to over-the-counter use. I'm absolutely changing the intended use from only doctors can prescribe this or use it to anybody can. That's a major change in intended use that will require a new submission. And also a change to a device that could significantly affect its safety or effectiveness. The burden's on you. You have to decide whether modification could significantly affect safety or effectiveness. And if you make a change, the justification should be recorded in your change control document, your records, ECOs, some people call them, ECNs perhaps, as to why no submission is required, and also who made that determination. Many of us leave that to our regulatory affairs or QA departments, people who oversee the writing of the 510Ks and therefore are more intimately familiar with the regulations to make this determination. There are situations in which a 510K is not required. Excuse me. A device isn't marketed or commercially distributed. Perhaps you're doing clinical trials. The devices are never leaving your control, or CRO, clinical research organization, that's operating as your firm, so to speak. If you distribute another firm's U.S. manufactured device, you're just a distributor. You're not the manufacturer. If the device is not manufactured by your company, but is marketed or distributed by your company, in this case, the labeling has to reveal the connection with the manufacturer. If a company named LifeTech, for example, is the distributor, they may choose to indicate on their labeling manufactured for LifeTech or distributed by LifeTech, whichever one. Either of these clearly indicates the connection. For firms that repackage and relabel, contrary to the earlier examples, situations in which the labeling or condition of the device is not significantly changed. For example, the labeling is the same, no 510K is required. Also, if you have a device that's been in commercial distribution since before May 28th, 1976, the pre-amendments devices, as we call them, a 510K is not required. It's been a bunch of years. It's coming up on 40 years at this point since the amendments went into effect. There were probably no devices out there. So suffice it to say that that is a possibility, but not a practicality. If you're an importer of a foreign-made device, certainly make sure that the foreign manufacturer has a 510K, but you're not required to submit one. There are some devices that are exempt from 510K by regulation, and here's the location to those. And when you find your device, make sure it says exempt from pre-market notification submission, and therefore no 510K is required. And last, a 510K is not required if you change your device, and the change cannot significantly affect the device's safety or effectiveness. Which brings us to this guidance document. And the current version of this guidance document, here's the location of it on the internet, is distributed for comment purposes only, but it's been distributed for comment purposes only for quite a few years, as you can see. It doesn't really change from the previous iteration of this document, so it's been the same. It's been in use for a very long time. It's merely a guidance document. However, it's a guidance document that is used throughout the industry. I've copied some pages of the determination flow chart, which is when you need to submit a 510K. And the cover shot here determines, 1, 2, 3, 4, determines the origin of the change. Was the change due to a recall or corrective action? Well, if it was, you have to see a completely other guidance document that I'm merely pointing to it during this presentation, but for most of the cases, most of the attendees, it's one of the other changes. It's either a labeling change, technology or performance change, or a materials change. And we will review charts A, B, and C with all their areas of determination. If it's none of these changes, then you do not need to submit a new 510K. When it says documentation, as it does here on the bottom left, no 510K is required. Flowchart A begins with the first question that asks, A1 asks, does the change affect the indications for use? And the way I'll be doing a little jumping back and forth throughout this presentation, because rather than just include the flowchart itself, I've given some kind of examples throughout and with exceptions throughout the presentation. So the question is asked, does the change affect the indications for use? Well, if it does, as you can see here, yes to the right, you need to submit a new 510K. And the indications for use, here's a definition, and it's pretty much the target population. So anytime you change the target population, you do need to submit a new 510K with the following exception, as it says here, if you limit the use. So examples of changes that do impact intended use are reuse of a device labeled, previously labeled, single use only, a change from a prescription device to an over-the-counter device. If you go from an over-the-counter device to a prescription device, there's no 510K required because I am, in coordination with the exception here, limiting the use. I'm not extending the use, I'm limiting it. Going to A2, next question to ask yourself is, are you changing the warnings or precautions? And a warning and a precaution definitions required here. A warning is an alert which, if not avoided, could result in death or serious injury. A precaution, a little less serious, is a potentially hazardous situation which may result in minor or moderate injury or perhaps damage to the equipment. So warning is much more serious. If you change the warning or precaution, you do not need to submit a 510K. However, if you are not changing a warning or precaution, you're going to continue to go down to A3, which asks us, are we adding an indication? And what it says, A3, if you're adding an indication, interesting choice of terminology here. It says new 510K change being affected to the right of A3. A contraindication is when a device should not be used. So what you're doing is you're realizing, based on some data, that there are situations in which your device shouldn't be used. Previously, you thought it was okay, but now you don't think it's okay. The FDA definitely appreciates you taking care of this on their behalf, so it allows you to continue to market your device with the modified labeling till the 510K is approved. So you must submit, but you can continue to market at the same time. A4 says, is my labeling changed? Am I deleting a contraindication? If the answer is yes, I must submit a new 510K, because when you delete a contraindication, as opposed to adding one, you're typically expanding the indications for use. An example is there's a physical restraint. And previously, it was contraindicated for use with individuals who weighed less than 100 pounds. But now I want to remove this contraindication. So now what I'm saying is that you have to weigh less than 100 pounds to use it previously. And now I'm saying, no, you know what? Now anybody can use it. Well, I'm expanding the indications for use. I'm expanding the patient population. So now I've got to submit a new 510K. And the last part of the labeling flowchart is, A5 says, am I just making the labeling clearer? So I'm just clarifying, I'm not making any substantive change in A5 to the labeling. I'm just making it clearer for either to make it safer to use or more effective to use. I'm doing this based on information I receive or perhaps proactively. So when I'm doing this, as you can see A5, when it says yes, documentation, meaning I don't need to submit a 510K. If your labeling is changing in a way other than any of these changes, you do need to submit a new 510K. Flowchart B is talking about the operation of the device itself, technologically or performance-wise. So B1, 2, and 3, as you can see here, ask different questions, but they have the same determinations. Are you changing either a control mechanism, an operating principle, or an energy type? And some examples that I feel is important. Technology and performance has such a broad range of characteristics. When it comes to control mechanism, an example is changing something from analog control to digital control. Maybe a respiratory care device is being changed from pneumatic to electronic control. An operating principle in B2 is, for an example, is changing a piece of software, the image display algorithm, from back projection, which is the standard way of doing things, to some kind of new radiation efficient method. It operates in a different manner now, so you do need to submit a new 510K. Any minor algorithm changes, code changes that are easily validated via software validation might not require 510K. We'll take a look at decision B8 when we get there. And a change in energy type, yes, a 510K is required if I'm changing from AC mains to battery power, or vice versa. Looking at 4 through 8, B4 through 8, says, are you changing the environmental specifications, performance specifications, ergonomics, dimensional specs, or software or firmware? Excuse me, there's B8, by the way. And all of these prompt me, as you can see here, to go to B8.1, which says, am I affecting the indications for use? That's the key determination in this area. Is it being used in a different way? Because if it is, the change it creates an implied new indication for use. It's more of an actual indication for use than it is an implied indication for use. So now that we've determined that the indications for use are being changed, B8.2 says, well, do I need clinical data to establish safety and efficacy? And if I do, I need a new 510K. But if I don't, does the design validation that I've performed, is that raising any new issues that I hadn't anticipated? And if it is, I need to submit a new 510K. But if it's not, 8.3 no, I can go to documentation. In the design validation, what you want to make sure of is that the validation activities pass. When you pass your design validation, I'm being very colloquial, of course, you are by definition not raising any new issues of safety or efficacy. Since we've looked at B4 through 8, we're going to head now to B9, which says, am I changing the packaging or am I changing the expiration dating? If I am, I only need to do documentation. And the reason for this, going back to the chart for a moment, is because when I change my packaging or my expiration dating, I'm regulatorily required to do process and or design, and in some cases sterilization validation. I must do internal validation to make these changes. And what the agency is saying is that, you know what, do it on your own. You have to do it anyway. You don't need to send it to us. You don't need to wait for our determination. Keep it by yourself, and of course you have the ultimate responsibility of assuring its adequacy. B10 says, are you changing your sterilization? In situations like this, either we're changing our sterilization parameters, or, you know what, we're keeping our parameters exactly the same, but we're changing sterilizers, we're changing the facility, or in the most obvious case, we're changing our sterilization mechanism. We're changing from ETO to gamma, for example. In these situations, if my sterility assurance level or performance specifications, if I'm doing gamma or ETO, for example, there are different characteristics that are measured in the ISO standards. If they don't raise any, if they, don't change, don't decrease the sterility assurance level or change any performance specifications. If everything is the same, B10.1 may be answered no, and I go to documentation. But if my sterility assurance level or other sterility-based characteristics are changed, I do need to submit a new 510K. Flowchart C is a materials change. in this situation, we're changing what our device is made out of. So C1 says, is the device an in vitro diagnostic? If it is, it's sending me to chart D, and I'm not really referencing chart D during this presentation. In my years of presenting this, the overwhelming majority of attendees, I can only remember perhaps one or maybe two situations in which an attendee manufactured an in vitro diagnostic. And if any of you do this, I recommend you look for other similar webinars that focus on the 510K implications of the IVD, of the in vitro diagnostic. However, for this presentation, we're saying no, none of us have in vitro diagnostics. So the next question is there a change in material type? And whether there's a change in material type, C2, or a change in material formulation, C3, if I'm changing one of those, I'm going to see 2.1 on the right. And the question I'm asking myself is the device an implant? Okay, so as you can see here, we're progressing throughout here, and if the device is an implant, I'm further asking myself another question, which is, will the affected part of the device be contacting body tissues or fluids? So what I'm looking at now is biocompatibility. And if the answer is yes, the device is an implant in 2.1, it will or is likely to contact body tissues or fluids, that's a new 510K right there. Even if the testing has already been performed, you are required to submit a new 510K. However, if C2.1 is no, and the device is not an implant, that takes us to C2.2. And now my question is the affected part of the device, the part I am changing, is it likely to contact body tissues or fluids? So is it likely to? Not does it, but is it likely to? So you have to look, most of us perform risk assessments and process FMEAs and design FMEAs to determine the likelihood of parts of our devices contacting body tissues or fluids or in vivo fluids. In situations where we conclude that there is a likelihood, not a possibility, but a likelihood, C2.2.1 says, based on ISO 10993-1, which is the biocompatibility standard, is additional testing required? And what's important here on the second bullet point is additional testing required, 510K required, under 2.2.1 is the word additional. If you have already performed biocompatibility testing, then the answer to this question is no, additional testing is not required. Agency doesn't want to stop you from changing to they don't want to make unnecessary hoops for you to jump through for you to change to a material that you have already qualified, perhaps on one of your own other devices, or to a material that is universally acknowledged as being safe and effective, or if not universally acknowledged, biocompatibility data is available. Make sure, though, in 2.2.1 that when you claim you have your biocompatibility data, you actually have it all. ISO 10993 is used for FDA considerations. To be able to say that your product is USP Class 6 leaves out cytotoxicity testing, which is required in ISO 10993. So just remember that there's an additional test. Fortunately, in most cases, it's the cheapest and shortest test that's required over and above Class 6. The next question in the draft here is if C2.1 is no, not an implant, and C2.2 is no, it's not the part I'm changing is going to be completely internal to the operation of the device. Am I changing the device performance specifications? Well, if I am, as you recall, flowchart B dealt entirely with performance specifications. So this directs me now back to that chart. And if I'm not changing device performance specifications, then I can merely include documentation. looking at, but if you say that you are going back to C1, C2, and 3, no, I'm not changing the material type, neither am I changing the formulation, but I am changing the material supplier. So I'm no longer purchasing this material from supplier A. I'm now purchasing this same material from supplier B. And of course, I have documentation to objective evidence to support this. If I order material, C4.1 says material ordered to spec. And what that means is you spec that material out. You have a list of characteristics that it has this much polyurethane, this much of a particular colorant by percent or by weight of material. That is considered a spec. I'm not just saying to the supplier, give me some of that plastic stuff. I'm saying I want something that's 82% polyurethane and 5% PVC with 1% colorant, and this is the colorant name. That's my spec. In C4 and C4.1, I am not changing the material at all. I'm merely changing who I'm ordering it from, either for reasons of price or availability or delivery. But if I am not an IVD, C1, not changing the material type, not changing the material formulation, and not changing the material supplier, I can just do it internal. There's nothing that requires me to submit a 510K in that situation. Now that we've covered sort of the hows and whys, I do want to speak to the types of 510Ks that are out there and sort of go through them in a little bit of detail. The first type of 510K is a traditional 510K. It's usually used for an original 510K, brand new one, or a modification to a previously cleared device. Some of us use specials for our modification 510Ks, but you can use a traditional for a modification if you so decide. Section 1 is the user-fee cover sheet, and the FDA will not do anything without the user-fee cover sheet with your 510K. You've got, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to submit a copy with your check, but you're also going to submit a copy with your 510K. The Section 2 is the CDRH, the submission cover sheet, and it's a voluntary form. I always like to use it. I want the reviewer to know the sections of my 510Ks before he or she reviews it. I don't want there to be any surprises. And here's the location of each of these forms. Section 3 is the cover letter. Make sure that your cover letter is on your company letterhead and it's hand-signed by the submitter. Make sure it has a title on top, 510K notification. Again, whatever I can do to make it easier for the reviewer to just continue to operate as a matter of fact, that's what I want to do. The administrative section contains the type of 510K submission. Is it an abbreviated one or a traditional one? Common name of the device, the 510K submitter, who they should call or contact, not just by name, title, and phone number, but obviously email address also. What classification, regulation, and device classifications I'm referencing that this device falls under. The classification panel and the product code as well. And why am I submitting this document? Is it new? Am I modifying it? New indication for use? Just something to give the reviewer a heads up as far as what to keep an eye out for. The next section of the cover letter is the design and use of device. And I've got to answer each of these questions. I'll just pretty much copy, paste, write yes or no after each of these. Section 4 is the indications for use statement. Here's its location also. Make sure when you populate the indications for use statement that it is that the wording you use is identical throughout the submission, including on your labeling, on your proposed labeling, excuse me. The next section is either the 510K summary or the 510K statement. It is entirely up to you. Those of us who choose the 510K summary should give a brief, couple of pages usually, summary of the device and the supporting information. Those of us who feel like we want to gamble a little bit will include a 510K statement, and it's a certification, and it says, you know what, within 30 days, I'm going to submit a copy of the 510K that's redacted, of course, with exclusions, with proprietary information pulled out within 30 days. You're better off spending the extra couple of minutes, I don't know, half hour, and putting together the 510K summary than being bothered down the road for your 510K itself. And here's a link to, here's a citation to that statement. The truthful and accuracy statement certifies that all the information is true and you haven't left anything out. The Class 3 summary and certification obviously is only for Class 3 devices, and it's located at this location. And the financial certification or disclosure statement is only needed if you submit clinical data. However, you have to submit one for each clinical investigator, a certification for each clinical investigator, and a disclosure for each clinical investigator. Section 9 is the Declaration of Conformity and the Summary Reports. This is limited to abbreviated 510Ks, and it references any declarations of conformity that you're going to, upon which you're going to rely in your submission. If you want to rely on a recognized standard or guidance, you can include either a declaration of conformity or a statement that testing will be conducted in the future and it will meet specified acceptance criteria. One of the beauties of the abbreviated 510K is you can submit and then begin your testing right away using the statement. Section 10 is the executive summary. It's a description of the device, indications for use, a couple of words on the technological aspects of it, a device comparison table between your device and the predicate device. We've already gone over previously the ways to identify substantial equivalence and a summary of the performance testing that was done. Section 11 is device description, and it includes your performance specifications, your design requirements, all of the models, including all the accessories and components that you intend to market with this device. And if you feel that you want to include detailed information, such as diagrams, schematics, this is the section in which to include that, and a list of all the patient contacting components, direct and indirect, and their respective materials, what they're made out of. Section 12 is the SE, the substantial equivalence discussion. And this is where you're going to identify your predicate device or devices, and you're going to compare your device and the predicate device using whatever characteristics you decide. I like to use indications for use and technology as much as possible. And the substantial equivalent flowchart is located at this location as well. Section 13 is not titled labeling. It's titled proposed labeling. The agency understands that we may change our labeling over the years and even after we submit our initial submission. But we have to submit what we believe our inner and outer packaging is going to look like, as well as our package insert. Section 14 is sterilization and shelf life, in which you include your, of course, sterilization validation information and your shelf life testing. When you perform shelf life testing, remember you've got to show two things. You've got to show that after the aging period, your device is still sterile, that it has retained its packaging integrity, and that it still works after the period, either accelerated or real-time. Section 15 is biocompatibility, and at the risk of going through this, there's a list of requirements that references ISO 10993 in the fourth bullet point in the section. You're going to submit a summary of the results in the 510K. I don't necessarily need to. I find that sometimes I don't want to include the entire testing, because each of the tests is sometimes 8 to 10 pages, if not more. But if I am using my own product as predicate device, and I know what the material is, and I know that it's the exact same material and composition, I'm going to include the statement at the bottom of this slide in my 510K. Section 16 is software. If your device is software driven, you've got to make sure that you include documentation as provided in the software guidance document. Any EMC or electrical safety information is Section 17. Any bench performance testing, that's your in-house non-clinical testing. So you've got to make sure that your validation and verification testing is included in here. Make sure that you have a protocol and also a results document. Also make sure that in your results document, you have a nice little summary of the results and a conclusion. Depending on the nature of your bench testing, your testing may be dozens of pages long. You're going to have to include it, by the way. Therefore, the longer and more in-depth it is, the easier it is, and the more appreciative the reviewer is to look at a summary of the results and a conclusion of the results saying that the device is safe and effective. If you can get a predicate device, if it's yours, you certainly can. If it's your customers, sometimes you can use maybe a friend of your company that you can fund to buy a handful of the competitor devices, the predicate devices. The reviewers really like it when you perform comparative testing, comparative performance testing between your device and the predicate device. Sections 19 and 20 deal with animal testing or clinical testing. You're required to provide the same information between animal, clinical, and bench testing. When it comes to clinical testing, there's a little more information that's required, the certification that's listed here, and you've got to make sure that you comply with the IRB regulation as well as the informed consent regulation. A special 510K, as opposed to traditional, is one that you could submit more for a modification for a device as long as your modification does not affect the intended use or alter the fundamental scientific technology. The reason why, this is probably the reason why most of us limit our special 510Ks to product line expansions or new devices that we ourselves are manufacturing. Because how can we possibly know what the fundamental scientific technology of a device is unless we design and or manufacture it? You use the information from your design control process to clear the application. That's the information you're providing. It's okay to declare conformance to design controls without providing the data. You're going to provide a declaration of conformity. You're certainly going to have conducted a risk analysis to show that the design outputs meet the design inputs. And FDA certainly intends to process special 510Ks in 30 days, but I intend to do a lot of things I don't do also. What the FDA is really saying here is that they will prioritize the special 510Ks because they want you to continue, say what you want about FDA, but they understand that we're in the business of saving lives or improving, quality of life. They want us to continue to do that. If we're just tweaking an existing device that we ourselves are already manufacturing, they want to let us know that they will prioritize their review of that submission, and that's how they do this. The contents of the special 510K, you have a cover letter which clearly identifies that it is a special 510K. The cover sheet is the same cover sheet as the traditional 510K. The device name is just the trade name and the classification name. Address, registration information, sterilizer name if applicable. The classification of your device. The predicate device information, which is what device you're comparing it to, and when it's yours, it's just so much easier to prepare the special 510K. Labeling, you want to make sure that attachment 1 is your draft labels and IFUs. You want to include a statement that no changes have been made, or conversely identify what changes were made. State the intended use, but also explicitly state that this is the same intended use as the predicate device, and your indications for your statement is attachment 2. The device description comparison, you're pretty much in this section letting the reviewer know what changed. Obviously something changed because you're submitting a special 510K. I like to use the terminology on the bottom here. I don't necessarily feel the need to read it to you, but here it is. Feel free to use it in your special 510Ks as well. In the substantial equivalence section, similarities and differences between the two devices. I like to include a dozen characteristics, and when only 2 of them have changed, it really illustrates to the reviewer how little has changed between the 2 devices. I find that's much more effective than merely listing those 2 things that have changed. I like to include what has remained the same as well. Then I'm going to include a summary of the design control activities. I'm going to talk about the risk analysis method, perhaps a design FMEA or a process FMEA. I'm going to include a summary of the testing that was performed. I'm going to make sure, when it says state whether test methods are the same as the original, I'm going to make sure that they're the same. Your goal during a special 510K is to have as little as different as possible. Any differences you're going to have to explain or test away. And then a declaration of conformity with design controls is attachment 3. I'm going to have my 510K statement as attachment 4. My truthful and accuracy certification as attachment 5 is a quick summary for you of the attachments in a special 510K. And what I've done in this page is to give you the terminology that I've used in my 510K statement and in my certification of truthfulness and accuracy statement, both of which should be separate pages, should be signed, hand-signed, and dated on your letterhead. An abbreviated, the last 510K, can be used when a guidance document exists, and here are some guidance documents, or a special control has been established, or a relevant consensus standard has been recognized. While the benefit of the abbreviated 510K is an expedited review, it's a very unpopular way to submit a 510K. The agency is not that proactive in establishing consensus standards, special controls, and guidance documents. I recommend that you use one of the other 510Ks. Also, to a large extent, it's what the reviewers are more commonly used to. This titled New 510K Paradigm is not really much of a new paradigm. However, what you can see, it helps us on the top, on the industry, sort of figure out which type of 510K might suit us best to be submitted. And then it lets us know, without a lot of information, quite honestly, what the agency does when they look at each of our submissions. An expedited review is a review that the agency performs when the device is intended to treat or diagnose a life-threatening or horrible disease or condition and addresses an unmet medical need. Not one of these. If you have a device that is intended to treat or diagnose a life-threatening condition, but it's already met, you cannot get expedited review. These are some examples here of situations in which we're able to demonstrate meeting an unmet medical need. It's a breakthrough technology. No approved alternative treatment or diagnosis exists. Clinically meaningful advantages over the alternatives. The availability is in the best interest of the patients. That's very vague. And it leads to clinical improvement. There's a lot of information you have to provide to support the nature of the unmet medical need. When you have your 510K, the hard copy will be standard size. Put it in a temporary binder, usually a loose leaf kind of binder. Number each of the pages. This is probably less of an absolute requirement these days and more of a really good idea due to the fact that during the review of your 510K, it's going to be much easier for the reviewer to say, well, on page 73, third paragraph, here, please clarify this, as opposed to having to describe what's on the top of that page or the nearest page, number your pages. You've got to submit 2 copies. One must be submitted in electronic format, and the other doesn't have to be a hard copy. Send them to the agency at the Silver Spring at the Maryland address, at the national address, not one of your regional locations. And I definitely recommend that you use a method that's going to provide signed receipt of delivery. Registered mail, return receipt, FedEx, UPS, one of those. And also keep a copy for your records. Even if it's just a scanned copy, make sure you have one so that you can speak knowledgeably with the reviewer when they contact you. I mentioned earlier, very briefly, the concept of the third-party review. It's not eligible for every single device out there, but it is eligible for quite a few of them. In this case, when I have my 510K, I'm not going to submit it to FDA. I'm going to submit it what's called an accredited person. And the accredited person reviews the submission instead of the FDA because the FDA has licensed them, has authorized them to do this. And they make their recommendation to FDA. The FDA almost always concurs, and by almost always, I mean every situation I can recall in which I've either used a third party or people I work with in the industry have used third parties. Every situation I can recall, the agency has always concurred with the recommendation of the accredited person. By law, the agency has 30 days after receiving the recommendation. I don't know what you would do to them, but by law, they have 30 days. Like I said earlier, you don't have to pay for the 510K review, but you do have to pay the accredited person or company for their review. So the pros and cons are, first of all, make sure you use an eligible one, but usually you know to do that. The pros and cons are it's often cheaper. The accredited person usually charges more than the agency. However, the review time is usually shorter. So do you want to spend a few extra dollars, or do you want to save, or do you want it done quicker? Your choice. What FDA does when they get your submission is they log it in. They confirm that you paid your money. If not, it stops at that point. You receive a letter that says you haven't, and they won't do anything until you do. They assign a 510K number, and they send you your acknowledgement letter. This was the letter that I mentioned earlier that enables you to exhibit at trade shows. And then you're in line, you're in the queue. They're going to forward it they then forward it to the appropriate division based on the division that you've identified in your submission. And they're going to make sure that it's administratively complete, which is why if you have sections that are blank, benched clinical testing, for example, put a page that says clinical testing and then just write NA on it. And that way you avoid the possibility of failing the administrative review. After this, they will review the document and request additional information. When they, in the meantime of their reviewing, that they're waiting for this, they're going to give you 30 days, but they're going to put your submission on hold. And if you need more than 30 days, you've got to request an extension in writing. Because if they don't hear from you within 30 days with either your response or a request for additional time, in which case you want to let them know when you need the time you need time until, they'll just delete the submission from your system. You will not get your money back. Then they perform their review, and they either determine that you're substantially equivalent or not substantially equivalent, and they send their recommendation, which is always agreed with, to the branch chief and the division director for concurrence. They send you your decision letter via email, fax, email. I've gotten it any or all of those ways. If after 90 days of login you don't receive anything from them, you certainly should, on the 91st day, submit a status request. And here's the form to use. And it pretty much just asks where you are in the queue. They don't commit to anything, but you have a response for them and they know that you're waiting. If you receive an NSE equivalent in which your device is not substantially equivalent, got a couple of choices. You can resubmit a 510K with new data. You can request a Class 1 or 2 designation, in which case, if your device is a Class 3 device requiring a 510K, you may be able to be down-classified to Class 1 or 2, which in some cases precludes the requirement for 510K. In situations like this, it's best, what I've seen done is competitors actually reach out to each other to try to, as a group, get their device down classified. If my company does it, my competitors don't, because they've already gotten their 510Ks, the agency is not going to take my request very seriously. And I can file a reclassification petition, but that's not going to help at all. That's similar to the Class 1 or 2 designation, but in this case, I'm changing my device classification, my 3-letter pro code. Or I can realize that the reason I didn't get my 510K is because my device requires pre-market approval submission, and I'm going to submit a PMA. that's the end of the presentation, so I think we can open it for questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, like Jeff just said, this is your time. If you want to directly put forward any questions for Jeff, what you could do is you could click on the raise hand option, which is a palm back icon on your participant screen. That way we can go ahead and unmute your individual lines and you can directly put forward your questions for Jeff. Or you could also send your questions using the chat messenger or the Q&A panel. So if you have any questions for our presenter today, ladies and gentlemen, please do go ahead. And at the same time, we'd like to inform you all as well that if you do come up with questions at any time after today's session, you can forward those questions over to us and we'll make sure your questions are forwarded to our speaker to get you your answers. If you have any questions at the moment for our speaker, you could go ahead. And also would like to inform you all while we wait for the questions that today's webinar is available in a recorded format. So if you feel that any of your friends or colleagues or anybody else in your organization could benefit from today's session, you can have them log on to our website at globalcompliancepanel.com, or you can also give us a call on our numbers as well. Jeff, I have a question for you here. I'm just going to post it on your chat messenger.
Okay, the question reads, I have a question about changes to sterilization methods. If changing to gamma, which affects polymers, should a new 510K be created? The answer is yes. If you're changing from another method, ETO for example, to gamma, you will need to submit a new 510K.
Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff, there's another question which just popped in.
The question reads, we have a device that's in design now. We know it to be substantial equivalent. When do we submit the 510K? Little misunderstanding here. If your device is still in design, you can't know it's substantially equivalent until you perform the same type of performance testing that you performed on your predicate device. So you have to wait till you can perform all of your finished device testing to submit your 510K, your special 510K, obviously.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any final questions, you could go ahead. At the same time, just want to remind you all as well that we have a couple of webinars coming up in the future from Mr. Jeff Kassoff. So if you feel that these would be beneficial as well, you can see them on the screen and also on the handouts which you received. You could log on to our website. We have a dedicated web page for Mr. Kassoff as well, so you can go through the list of topics which are available for the future, and ones from the past as well, which are available in a recorded format. Jeff, I have a few more questions, so I'm just going to quickly post them here.
Okay, I have another question. The question reads, when is clinical data required? Interesting question. Clinical data is only required when you feel that you're unable to, by bench testing, provide data of safety and efficacy. So with regard to safety, you can perform biocompatibility testing in most cases on your device. And when it comes to efficacy, if your bench testing, if your in vitro testing, if you will, is insufficient, you will need to perform clinical testing. So I hope that clears that up.
Thank you, Jeff. And I have another question which just came in, so I just posted it on your chat column.
The question is, in the case of steam to gamma for titanium parts, can that be done without 510K? I'm actually going to go back into the presentation. Can I get, Mike, can I get a...
Yeah, I just passed on the controls, Jeff. You should have the presenter controls right now.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the decision tree. So it'll take me a few minutes. I'm not sure which slide it's on. Okay. Performance. Okay. If you look at B10, the question is, change to sterilization, yes or no? In this case, the questioner says, yes, we are absolutely changing from steam to gamma. So the question then is there a change in performance specifications? What that means is when your device, the performance of your device under steam, the previous sterilization, how does that performance compare to the performance of your device after exposure to gamma sterilization? Not just performance, but also physical characteristics. Is it discolored? Second issue is when it comes to sterility assurance level. How sure are you that your device is still sterile? What kind of sterilization validation testing have you performed when you changed from steam to gamma sterilization? If you can answer both of those questions with data, then you do not need to file a new 510K. The next question is, can a predicate device be a competitor's? The answer is absolutely it can.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time, but would like to inform you all that if you have any further questions, what you could do is you could pass your questions over to us, and we'll make sure these questions are forwarded to our speaker to get you your answers. And also, if you have any suggestions as well, you can pass those over as well, or you can always give us a call. And at the same time, the polling panel for today's webinar is open in the polling area, so request you to kindly share your feedback as well. We have over 8 simple questions, and they're all multiple choice in nature, so it shouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes to go ahead and share your feedback before you log off today's session as well. And also, we have webinars coming up from Mr. Kassoff, as you saw on screen, and again, there are a few more as well later on in the month of August as well. You could have a look on our website as well. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for participating in today's session. And on behalf of our speaker, Mr. Jeff Kassoff, and the entire Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all once again and hope the rest of the day is a lovely one. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Jeff.
You're welcome.